You're listening to China Africa Talk.
Jambo, ni Bridget akikuletea kipindi kinachohusiana na China na Afrika.
Vous écoutez le dialogue sino-africain avec Bridget.
Everything China, everything Africa.
Olá, você está ouvindo China Africa Talk com Bridget.
سيداتي وسادتي مرحبا بكم في الحوار الصيني العربي مع بريدجيت.
Welcome back to the program. This is China Africa Talk. I'm your host, Bridget Mutambirwa, coming to you from the Chinese capital in Beijing with more discussions on what's happening with China and Africa from a Chinese and African perspective. On September the 3rd, the world's attention turned to China as it hosted a military parade to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War. 26 foreign leaders, including Denis Sassou Nguesso, President of the Republic of Congo, and Emerson Mnangagwa, President of Zimbabwe, attended the commemorations. When we speak of World War II, the narratives that often come to mind are the Battle of Britain, the attack on the Pearl Harbor, and the D-Day landings. Far less known is the fact that China was the first nation to face the onslaught of Axis aggression. The invasion by Imperial Japan on September 18, 1931, marked the beginning of a 14-year brutal conflict in the main Eastern theater, during which China suffered over 35 million casualties.
Well, the world would be different and even more brutal if China stayed put without resistance to the Japanese aggression.
Similarly absent from mainstream accounts is the immense contribution of over 1 million common black Africans who fought and died in every major theater of the war, from Africa and Europe to the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Their deeds, like China's, have rarely been fully acknowledged.
Without Africa, I have a strong feeling that victory could have been delayed, if not denied. It is this shared history that invites Africa and China to transform memory into partnership.
This brings us to the crucial questions. What steps can China take to secure its rightful place in the global historical memory of World War II? And how can Africa better integrate its experience into the world's understanding of that pivotal conflict? To discuss this further, I'm now joined by Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center of International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics, and Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, Associate Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Nairobi. Now, I'll begin with you, Professor Liu. As the first country to face Axis aggression, China fought a prolonged and brutal war for 14 years. What was the strategic significance of China's theater in the overall Allied victory in World War II?
Well, the world would be different and even more brutal if China stayed put without resistance to the Japanese aggression, because if we go back to history, in 1936, there were trilateral treaties between Japan, Italy, and Germany to have the ambition to dominate the world, and particularly the entire Eurasia continent. Now, with such an evil axis that is being formed, China was the victim, but also China was the rising force to resist not only the Japanese aggression within the Chinese territory, but also to be able to help the allied countries to deter the formation of such a sort of evil global order. More specifically, from 1937 onward, Japan stationed more than half their military forces in China. So during the peak time, over 1.2 million Japanese soldiers were bogged down in this country. To be able to prevent them from spreading their vicious wings to the Pacific Islands, to Australia, and also to the Soviet Far East.
Right.
So this is a great deterring force. And the Chinese theater also supported the Allies logistically. So the after fall of the Burma in 1942, if I remember right, the Hump airlift became the only supply line into China with the US pilots flying tons of materials over the Himalaya at the extra cost and risk. The Burma Road and later the Lido Road also enabled the flow of supplies to stand not only Chinese resistance, but also to keep pressure on Japan's overreach logistically to the rest of the entire Asia. And moreover, the forward base in China also allowed the US Army, particularly their Air Force, to launch the first direct bombing raids on Japanese territory in 1944. So without China trying to tie down the Japanese aggressive edge and providing a continental front, the Pacific War would have been far more protracted and far more costly in property and in life. So these are really highly commendable, but unfortunately, they are not really correctly presented with the full picture to the global audience.
Still on you there, Professor Liu. Beyond the military conflict, China's war of resistance was a period of immense sacrifice and societal transformation, which you've also just highlighted there. Now, what were the profound human and long-term national legacies of this 14th year struggle for China?
Well, that is really a very painful memory for this entire nation over generations to come. So the human toll of China's 14 years of struggle was highly immense. So there was estimate that up to 20 million Chinese people's lives were lost, and with 80 million refugees displaced. The tragedy, like some of the big events, the Nanjing massacre in 1937, where over 300,000 civilians and war prisoners were totally slaughtered. So it symbolizes the brutality of such a conflict. And so many of those our cities, infrastructures, not only with Wuhan, Chongqing, Nanjing, or Guangzhou, starting from Shanghai, they endured relentless bombing. Many cities experienced the periods and the frequent air raids. So the war was also there to reshape the drive towards national unity and also towards Chinese growth of its all military might to counter-resist such sort of aggressive forces. And that was able to help the world to be able to end the war, and it also accelerated the Chinese state building efforts. With the end of such a brutal war, China was able to engage its own modernization drive, and diplomatically, China also emerged from the war as one of the big four allied powers. Now, after the Second War, we have enjoyed actually much of a more stable global order for peace and development, although regional conflicts were still going on.
Thank you so much there, Professor Liu, for explaining this. And even from your explanation, I get a detailed appreciation for where China is now. And I also get to understand some of these initiatives, like these peace programs that China often hosts and leads. And I also got an appreciation of where these things actually started. Now, over to you, Dr. Ombongi. While often overlooked, several key campaigns of World War II were fought on African soil. Now, which regions became critical fronts, and what were the most vital material and human contributions of African soldiers to the Allied war effort?
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Prof, for those extremely important thoughts that you have given. Perhaps, Bridget, before I answer your question, let me just begin by mentioning that, yes, it is now 8 years after this global conflict, which we describe as the Second World War. One clear thing that comes out of this is that both Africa and China were at once victims and then victors of this conflict.
Right.
And I think Prof has touched that a little bit. Victims because they both bore the scars of invention, the scars of occupation, conscription and exploitation.
Right.
And yet victors because their sacrifices contributed to the ultimate defeat of fascism and imperial aggression. And Bridget, this is the paradox, this paradox of being conquered and yet conquering, subordinated and yet triumphant, created a shared history of suffering and resilience between China and the continent of Africa in its various ramifications. And I think it is this shared history that invites African China to transform remembrance into what I see as collaboration and memory into partnership, which will be important if we all build towards the futures for our citizens in order to achieve dignity and development that the war did not bring or deliver to Africans or even the Chinese.
Right.
So to go directly to your question, let me just begin from the premise that Africa was a battlefield of a paradox of some kind. It is a soil often dismissed as fairly not very useful by the colonialists, became central in the struggle for the world's freedom. For example, the deserts of North Africa witnessed the context between the Axis forces and the Allied forces. For example, if you look at from El Alamein in Egypt to the sands of Libya and Tunisia, to the jungles and savannas of East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia,
Right.
they became arenas of liberation where African and Allied troops fought to expel the Italian forces.
Right.
In these campaigns, due to the fact that I'm from Kenya, Kenya played a distinctive role in this campaign, in what was called the East African Campaign. It provided soldiers, resources, and strategic routes. In fact, the King's African rivals, composed largely of East Africans, were dispatched not only across the continent, but even beyond to countries like Burma, the present-day Myanmar, and the jungles of Southeast Asia, where they fought with endurance far from home. African hands, for sure, carried rivals, dug trenches, drove supply trucks, and maintained lines of communication. Indeed, African feet marched across deserts and forests in defense of empires that were not their own. Thus, largely, I will say that Africa was not only the backdrop, but also the bloodstream of the Allied war effort. Its minerals fed the industrial anger of war machines. But the paradox is that yet this contribution has often remained in the margins of memory and history. Although without Africa, I have a strong feeling that victory could have been delayed, if not denied.
Still on you, Dr. Ombongi, to what extent were African participants fighting out of a shared belief on the Allied cause? To what extent were they compelled by the colonial structures of the time? How do we understand this duality? Because a lot of times, a lot of people don't understand, was this out of a shared belief in the Allied cause, or was it, compelled by the colonial structures of the time?
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. Here, the center of the question you are raising, I think lies one of the most intriguing contradictions of Africa's role in the war. Africans were at once agents of liberation and subjects of subjugation or oppression by the colonialists. Many who fought, I'm sure, wore uniforms stitched by empires that denied them equality, justice, and voice. Their rights as citizens were ignored, their futures literally mortgaged by colonial policies. Many who were conscripted through coercion. There were others who volunteered to participate in the war in search of livelihoods. And I'm sure some sought sheer adventure or even escape from local hardship. Often without, in my view, grasping the full implications of this global conflict.
Right.
I think then in this paradox of subjugation, in this paradox of domination, a seed of agency was planted or emerged. While fighting under foreign flags, Africans encountered new ideas of freedom, military discipline, and self-determination. Some believed in the Allied cause, others believed only in survival, but many returned, in my view, with sharpened awareness that they had shed blood for liberties denied at home, for freedoms denied at home. The irony of dying for democracy abroad while living in colonial subjugation at home then became a catalyst for Africa's post-war nationalist awakening. That as the African soldier of World War II was both an object of empire to be used, but on a much more positive side, that soldier was the precursor of Africa's freedom and the independence that we enjoy to date.
Professor Liu, Western narratives of World War II often focus on the European and Pacific theatres. Now, why do you believe China's immense sacrifice and contribution as the main Eastern Front against fascism have been historically underappreciated, and what steps can be taken to ensure it receives its rightful place in the global historical memory?
I think that's a very interesting question. China fought the longest continuous battle during the whole war for 14 years.
Right.
And now, as you mentioned, that it has been the under-communicated and underappreciated because of several reasons. One is that there is a sort of Western-centric type of narrative. The Western scholars, they dominate the publicity and communication across the world, so they have long centered on their closest experience, which was the war and its brutal destruction around Europe with the United States, rather than the entire Asia. It's not only China has been marginalized during such sort of narrative, the Burma, Vietnam, Philippines, etc. So I think that also is a sort of aspiration, your question, for these countries who really contributed to the end of the Second World War to be able to build better communication capacity to the rest of the world. And then the other is that, after the Second World War, it was really followed by the Cold War politics. So the Western states, they have little incentive to highlight the nationalist and the communist who really shared their sacrifice, which means the global politics for the division really overcasted such sort of contribution from China. And the third reason could be there have been the fragmented archives, also language barriers, and many of those sources have not been fully accessible to researchers, also to the media. Well, as you would suggest, so what are those steps to correct such sort of situation?
Right.
I think one is that the countries that contributed to such, not only China, but also many other countries, need to strengthen their communication capacity to the world, and they can really expand more of the joint historical research program, for example, between China and United States, between China and Europe, even between China and Japan, because Japan has really fully reflected on the malpractices and brutality that their previous generations had really committed in terms of the crime. And I think more outstandingly is that China has been the biggest victim, but China received no war repatriation. Because it is Chinese leadership who understand it is also the war that was launched by those, the warmongers, and Japanese common people are also victims in such a sort of aggressive power. And then we also need to take more initiative to incorporate more of the Chinese front into the international World War II museums, and placing, for example, Nanjing Massacre on par with the Auschwitz in terms of the remembrance. And we need to generate more of the media, movies, and short stories to tell and also remind the world of China's sacrifice and also contribution. And lastly, I think we also need to remember all those people who offered humanitarian aid to China from around the world, like Dr. Bethune from Canada, and also the German missionary and the trader who helped to save the over 200,000 lives in Nanjing, not to mention the Flying Tiger, who really joined forces with China in fighting against the aggressors. More of the textbooks also need to be incorporated to inform the younger generations that what was that, and more importantly, it is to remind them that war is not the choice, but also we need to strengthen our defense against any possible aggression, and also to inform people more ethically, to cast eyes on other people's territory, other people's happiness would end up in failure.
Dr. Ombongi, similarly, Africa's participation is frequently absent from the mainstream accounts. Now, why has this oversight persisted for so long, and how can we better integrate the African experience into the global understanding of World War II?
I think that marginalization in global historiography on the war of the Africans and the African continent is something we share with China, as Prof has put it. One of the celebrated Africa writers, the Nigerian Chinua Achebe, once wrote, and I quote, "Until the lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt will continue to glorify the hunter." That is actually what has been the tragedy of the African continent and the African contribution to the Second World War. Because Eurocentric notions, as professors noted, overly dominated the narratives that inform the cause, the causes, and the patterns of the World War II. And the African continent has a limited contribution in these historiographical narratives that inform their agency in the war. So what one will expect then is that the world needs to appreciate and recognize the need to mainstream the African agency, the African contribution, and the African role in the whole theater of what we describe as the Second World War. And remember, Bridget, that during the outbreak of the Second World War, there was only two independent countries in Africa. That is Ethiopia, after frustrating the Italians, and of course the former slave settlement of present-day Liberia. All the rest of the continent was under colonial domination. The Africans were not citizens of empire. They were subjects who were totally alienated from their background, dominated and controlled. Partially because of that, that is why they have been marginalized in the narratives, in the historical accounts of the Second World War. And I think this is the notion that I share with Prof, that it is time the story of the African agency in the Second World War be retold.
Professor Leo, the post-war world was fundamentally shaped by the victory of fascism. Now, what are the most crucial legacies of World War II, and why is it so important to safeguard the multilateral international order it spawned, including the United Nations system?
Well, the crucial legacy of the World War II is that they gave people a strong push to wake up towards humanity. They make people realize that the world are getting more and more interdependent on a smaller village. So therefore, the brutal war eventually will end up destructive to this living environment of each and every country, be it the victim or be it the victor in a particular war. So therefore, the ethical leadership appeared really to build a foundation in a modern global system like the United Nations, set up in 1945. It was really designed to prevent the Great Power War through collective security. And then the Bretton Woods institutions, including IMF, World Bank, also the GATT, they were able to stabilize the global finance, global trade, and also global reconstruction. The Marshall Plan was also there to send a strong notion that only by the economic security and prosperity, the root of the war can be prevented or at least reduced. So the Geneva Convention also set up the standard for humanitarian war. And as the professor of ethics, I strongly appreciate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was inspired also by the war atrocities, so that the respect to humanity and also to have equal respect to each and every living being in the world, be it Chinese, be it Europeans, or be it Africans. So I think, these are really very important, but in the meanwhile, we also call for more of the reform in such sort of institutions that continue to provide the momentum to ensure the prosperity, sustainability, and peace around the world, because we are facing many other immediate risks of such. For example, many countries are now stepping up more of their military expenditures than education. And we're dealing with more of their power diplomacies rather than promoting people-to-people exchange. So these are really the fresh issues that we need to reflect why the war and how the war can be further prevented from its spread, and also to educate our younger generation how to cherish and how to defend the human dignity.
Now, just to wind off our discussion, I'm going to ask both of you this question. Now, as we mark this 80th anniversary, reflection must be paired with action. Now, are there existing joint initiatives like the Global Security Initiative and other mechanisms that China, Africa, and the world can strengthen to promote lasting peace and security, both locally and globally? What are your takes? Perhaps let's start with Dr. Ombongi. Your thoughts?
Of course, we have seen the world really moving towards strengthening efforts to control violence and war in the scale that was witnessed during the Second World War. But then, despite all this effort, I'm glad Professor mentioned about the declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which followed immediately after the Second World War. But despite this becoming a common, understanding in the world today, we still have countries, we still have continents that are very marginal to the world efforts in bringing peace and stability. But also we have still hotspots around the world which seem to be nurturing situations that can easily lead to alliances that can destabilize the world one more time. But I'm glad that global powers such as China and many others are working towards alliances that promise the world peace and stability one more time. But we need to strengthen this, but more importantly, mainstream other countries that are very marginal when it comes to global hegemony and global decision making on what affects the world. We have talked quite a lot about the role of the Security Council, particularly within the United Nations,
Right.
The countries that have veto powers and all that.
Right.
But then when you look generally, the African continent still is fairly peripheral in all these processes. So mainstreaming Africa, mainstreaming African countries is what I can call for in order to make it play its role in the international system.
And your thoughts there, Professor Liu?
Well, I think one is that leadership need to examine what people exactly need. Simply want a better life, a stable job. That's something that a leadership can really work out to cater.
Right.
And the fact that China is really taking the lessons that also coming up from the scars of those wars and realize how important really to cherish the livelihood of their people. So therefore, China does not really cast its eyes on other people's territories, but with the connectivity, and we offer the infrastructure construction, and we also offer scholarships for capacity building. And so this is something that is really to showcase that how the peace and prosperity can be preserved only by working together to deliver the tangible benefits to their own people and provide the education and skill sets, also to enlarge people's vision by remembering history and learn the lessons and make it forward the constructive approach. And this is the way that China would go for. I believe our African partners will also be able to share and resonate with such a sort of initiative for development, security, and civilization.
Maybe I
Yes.
may weigh in very quickly,
Okay.
Bridget, if you allow me a second.
Okay.
Just from where Prof has left. One thing that is clear from history, I'm a historian, Africa and China know the pain of occupation, the cost of war, and the wholeness of victories unaccompanied by justice, in my view.
Right.
This collective memory is a moral compass for a new international order. So together, Africa and China can articulate peace that is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of dignity, a peace that learns from the contradictions of World War II, that one can win militarily, yet lose morally, that one can be a victor on the battlefield and a victim in the balance sheet of history. And therefore, the joint vision between Africa and China is one peace rooted in equity, sovereignty, and human development. Just as Africa and China once stood on the peripheries of global power, they can now stand at the center of global conscience. From victims and victors, they can become visionaries. Thank you very much.
Wow. Hopefully this spirit of peace spreads around the world as well as we commemorate post-World War II. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Listeners, you can subscribe to our online newsletter on CGTN or Substack to get more insights on China-Africa relations. Just search China-Africa Talk. For now, it's goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post it on social media or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. See you next time.